In this tutorial, we are going to print a right angle triangle that faces right up. So let's take a quick look at the structure here. First, we have one star printing. That is, on the first row we have 1 star. On the second row, 2 stars. Third row, 1, 2, 3, 3 stars. Fourth row, 4 stars. On the fifth row too, we have 5 stars. And the sixth row too, we have 6 stars. And on the last row, that is the 7th row, we have 7 stars. So what we are seeing here is that the number of stars keeps increasing with the number of rows that we have over here. That is, as the number of rows increases, the number of stars also increase. That is 1 for the first row, 2 for the second row. So we have to design a loop which will have the number of stars printed controlled by the number of rows. So we are going to use 2 loops, that is 2 for loops here. We are going to print a right angle triangle using asterisks, and it's going to be a right angle triangle facing right up. First, I'm going to define a method. It's going to be a void method, and I'm calling it right triangle. This method is going to accept an integer value, so I'm defining a parameter called n, and that's defines the number of rows that we have in the triangle, that is the right angle triangle that we are going to print. Here we are going to use nested loops, and the first loop I'm defining is a for loop, and the control variable for the for loop, I'm calling it rows. I'm initializing it from 0, and this loop is going to run when rows is less than n, that is the number of rows that we pass to the method, and after each iteration the rows variable is going to increase by 1. That is called the outer loop. That is the outer loop, and it takes care of the number of rows. So this defines the number of rows. That means that when we pass a 7 to n, the loop is going to run 7 times, because during the first iteration we are going to have 0 less than 7. Of course 0 is less than 7, it will run, and after that rows will increase by 1. Then we have 1 less than 7, 2 less than 7, up to 6 less than 7. 7 less than 7 is not going to run, so we are going to have from 0 to 6, and from 0 to 6 to that is, we have 7 digits, that is from 0 to 6, so it means it's going to run 7 times. We are also going to have an inner loop, which is going to take care of the columns that we are going to have in the right angle triangle, and I'm defining another variable. I'm calling it calls, initializing it to 0, and calls is going to run. Calls is going to be controlled by the variable rows. If you look at the diagram very well, you see that during the first iteration, that is on the first row, we have just 1 asterisk. On the second row we have 2 asterisks. Third row we have 3 asterisks. Fourth row we have 4. So that means that the number of rows increase with the number of asterisks that we have per each row. As we go down the rows, we have the number of asterisks or stars also increasing. Alright, so what is going to happen here is that columns, the variable columns is going to iterate when columns is less than or equal to rows, and after each iteration columns is going to increase by 1. Let us try to understand what we have here. What this means is that when we have 2 loops, that is when we have nested loops, for each run of the outer loop, the inner loop will have a complete run. So if the inner loop is going to run 5 times, then that means that during the first iteration the outer loop will run once, the inner will run 5, then we'll go back, the outer will run another once, then it goes on like that. So the inner loop runs completely before the outer loop runs, and this is going to be the inner loop here. So there is inner loop, and the inner loop takes care of the number of columns. If you look at the diagram very well, you see that we are printing the stars on the columns. So the rows is taking care of the number of rows that we have in the plain figure, while the columns, that is the variable columns, is actually printing them. So what we're going to have here is that we have the print method print the asterisk to the console. So print a star, and that is what is happening here. So during the first iteration, let me give a space here. Yeah, during the first iteration, we are going to have the outer loop run once. It will run once, and for example, if I pass the number 7 to the method, then n is 7. So that means that we are going to have rows will be 0 here. So we will have 0 less than 7, and of course 0 is less than 7. So this will run once, and we will come here. Then we have columns from 0. So we have columns less than or equal to rows. So we are going to have 0 is less than or equal to 0, and of course 0 is less than or equal to 0. So it will run once, and that is to say we will have 1 star printed. Then after that, the next thing here is that because we evoked the print method, the cursor will be left on the same line, and during the next iteration we want the cursor to go to the next line. So I'll call the print line method here, and I will not print anything to the console, but I will just call it so that it will print nothing and it will move to the next line. The print line method, when it is evoked, it prints something, or when it doesn't even print anything, after execution it goes to the next line. So what I have here is that I'll say go to the next line. So that is how things are going to be here. So this is the method that we are going to use to print the program. But back to the main method here, we don't have anything here. We have not defined anything. We have not called the method, so we are yet to call the method. And to do that, we have to have a value passed to the method. So I'm going to declare another value. I'm calling it number. So that is the number of rows, and let me pass the figure 7 to it, or the value 7 to it. So that is the number of rows in the right angle triangle. But of course the number of rows is also equal to the number of columns. Yeah, and I'm going to call the method here. So, and I'll pass number to it. Yeah, so if you look at what is happening here in the main method, I am calling the method right triangle, and that means that this will execute, and I'm passing the variable 7 to it, that is number to it. So that means that we are going to have a right angle triangle that has got 7 rows and 7 columns. Alright, let me run this and let's see what is happening here. Yeah, so that is what we are seeing. The first row we have star, that is 1 star. Second row 2, third row 3, fourth row 4, fifth 5, 6, and 7th we have 7 stars. So let us see what is happening. As I did say, the outer loop will run once. When you have nested loops, the inner loop runs completely for each run of the outer loop. So when the outer loop runs once, the inner loop is going to run completely. So during the first iteration, columns will hold the value 0, and rows will of course be 0 here. So we will have 0 is less than or equal to 0, and of course 0 is less than or equal to 0. So that is true. So that means that the inner loop will run once. In other words, it will print star, and that's what we see over here. So we see the first star here. Now after printing the star, the print method will leave the cursor on the same line. We don't want the cursor to be on the same line. So when after printing the star, or after the inner loop has finished executing, it will now move to the outer loop. System.out.println is found in the outer loop here, so you can see it here. So immediately the inner loop finishes executing, it moves to the outer loop, and in the outer loop we have system.out.println, and it doesn't print anything, but it moves to the next line because of the print line method. So after this, we have the cursor move down. So during the second iteration, the outer loop will run once and the inner loop will run completely, and that's what we are going to have. We are going to have 0 is less than or equal to 1, because of course after the first iteration we had the rows value increased by 1. So here during the second iteration, rows is gonna hold the value 1 here. So we will have columns, that is columns will be 0, so we will have 0 is less than or equal to 1, and of course 0 is less than or equal to 1. So that means that the print method will print the star and the cursor will be on the same line. So after the first star here, the cursor will still be on the line, and then the value of the columns will now be increased by 1, so that we will now have 1 is less than or equal to 1, and of course 1 is also less than or equal to 1. So that means the print method under the inner loop will still print another star, and we have the second star down here, and the column or the calls variable will increase by 1 for the third iteration or the third iteration. So we are going to have 3 is less than or equal to 2, and of course 3 is not less than or equal to 2. So that makes this Boolean expression false, and that means that it will not run again, and it will now leave the inner loop and come to the outer loop, and in the outer loop this line will also execute, and that means that it will not print anything, but after the print line method has run, it will go to the next line. So we will have the third line here, that is where we have the 3 asterisks. During the third iteration, we will have the value of rows increase to 2, and when the inner loop executes, we are going to have 0 is less than or equal to 2, that is true. 1 is less than or equal to 2, that is true, and 2 is less than or equal to 2, that is also true. So that means that it is going to run 3 times 0 1 2, and that will be for the third iteration. So all of these things are going to be printed, and when it is complete, it will leave the inner loop, and in the outer loop you have this line also printed, which will move the cursor to the next line for the fourth iteration. So it will continue like that. Now we can make a slight modification in this code. Now what if we don't want to use less than or equal to? You can use just less than, but when you use less than, it will make the first iteration even impossible. That is, during the first iteration we will have 0 is less than 0, and 0 is not less than 0, because during the first iteration the value of calls will be 0, and the value of rows will also be 0, because the inner loop will be taking the value of rows from the outer loop. But we can change this by adding 1 to the number of rows. If we don't want to use the less than or equal to, we can add 1 to this, so that during the first iteration we will have 0 is less than 0 plus 1, and 0 plus 1 is 1. So that makes sense, and when we run this, it's still going to give us the same thing that we have over here. Yeah, we will have the same thing, as you can see. Some people also may want to start from 1. You can also do the same thing. You can let rows start from 1 here. If you let rows start from 1, and that means, if you want it to run for the number of times that you specify, that is for the value of n, then that means that if you want rows to start from 1, then you have to change the less than to less than or equal to. Yes, because if it is going to start from 1, then that means that it's not going to run from 0. So that means it has gone past 1 index. So you have to say less than or equal to 0, so that you have the indices 1 2 3 up to 7. And if that is the case, then there will be no need to add +1 here, because of course during the first iteration the value of the rows is going to be 1, so there is no need to add 1 to this. So with this one we are going to have 0 is less than 1, and that is very plausible, because 0 is less than 1 is going to run, and 1 is less than 1 is not true. So you have just 1 being run over there. And when is this, we are also going to have the same thing, and you have the same thing printed out. So you have 1 up to 7. So it depends on how you want things to go. You can do it anything or anyhow. You can also start from 1 here, calls from 1 here if you want it, but that means that you have to also make this less than or equal to, because if it is not so, it is not going to run, because during the first iteration we are going to have 1 is less than 1, and that is not true, but 1 is less than or equal to 1 will make it run. Okay, and when you test it and see, of course you are going to see the same thing here, and it will start from 1 and goes to 7. So coding is pretty much how you understand it and how you arrange your lines and your variables. All right, that is that for today.